Major gas discovery. Angola has confirmed a significant offshore gas discovery off the country's coast. The landmark discovery was announced by Angola's National Oil and Gas Agency last week. It follows the drilling of the Gajeria-1 well, which is also located in the Lower Congo Basin. Preliminary estimates suggest that the field may hold more than 1 trillion cubic feet of gas and up to 100 million barrels of associated condensate.
Is in the headlines, and that is Angola, the 7th largest in the continent by size, the 8th largest in terms of GDP. Angola is one of the better off African nations, and a major reason for this is oil. Angola is the 2nd largest oil producer in sub-Saharan Africa, but lately its oil output has been stifled by the global oil cartel, OPEC. OPEC has been slashing oil production for months. This is to control oil prices globally. The most recent cut was announced on the 30th of November. Now, Angola has been complaining about these production cuts for a while, and it has finally reached a breaking point. Yesterday, Angola officially left OPEC, breaking with the cartel after about 16 years.
For decades, the United States stood at the very center of global energy. Washington dictated the rules, set the prices, and built its military dominance on the flow of oil and gas. But today, something extraordinary is happening, and it's happening in Africa. From Nigeria to Angola, from Mozambique to Algeria, a continent long dismissed as a mere resource colony is rewriting the global energy map. With more than 125 billion barrels of proven oil reserves and 600 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, Africa is no longer content to supply raw resources at discount prices. Instead, it is building pipelines, refineries, and LNG terminals. It is signing new deals not with Washington or Paris, but with Beijing, Moscow, and BRICS allies. It is creating jobs for its own citizens, refining oil locally, and demanding that payments be made in African currencies, in yuan or in rubles, but not always in US dollars. The result is nothing short of a $3 trillion earthquake shaking the very foundation of Western dominance. Western oil giants like ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, and TotalEnergies are losing ground. The IMF and World Bank, once the enforcers of Western control, are being defied. And in capitals across Europe and America, panic is setting in. Because if Africa flips the energy script, the US dollar, the very lifeblood of American power, could collapse. This is not just an energy story. This is a revolution. A revolution in which Africa finally takes its rightful place at the center of global power. Stay with us as we uncover how Africa's oil and gas boom is destroying US energy dominance, shocking the West, and giving rise to a new world order. To understand why this moment is so historic, we must go back to the beginning. When colonial powers first discovered oil in Africa in the early 20th century, they did not see prosperity for Africans. They saw profit for themselves. In Nigeria, oil was discovered in Oloibiri in 1956 by Shell. From that moment, the Niger Delta became one of the most exploited oil regions in the world. Billions of dollars were pumped out of the ground. Tankers carried crude to Europe and America. Yet the people of the Delta remained among the poorest in Nigeria, their rivers poisoned by oil spills, their lands destroyed. In Gabon, Cameroon, and Congo, France's oil giant ELF, now known as TotalEnergies, established dominance. Oil money flowed into Paris, not into Libreville or Brazzaville. In Angola, Chevron and ExxonMobil dominated production, while millions of Angolans lived in poverty after decades of civil war, a war fueled in part by foreign interests hungry for resources. And it wasn't just the companies. The IMF and World Bank played their part, forcing African governments into structural adjustment programs that demanded privatization, deregulation, and the opening of markets to foreign corporations. African nations were told, export your oil, export your gas, and in return you will get loans. But those loans came with strings attached, strings that kept Africa dependent. Even the U.S. military became part of this system. The creation of AFRICOM, the United States Africa Command, was less about terrorism than about securing energy routes. Oil fields, pipelines, and shipping lanes were guarded in the name of security. Meanwhile, Western media painted Africa as corrupt, unstable, and incapable of managing its own resources. But African leaders knew the truth. Leaders like Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana warned that Africa's wealth was being looted. Sankara famously said, "He who feeds you controls you." And in the case of energy, he who controls your oil controls your destiny. For decades, that destiny was dictated by Washington, Paris, and London. But now, Africa is rising. Something extraordinary is unfolding across Africa. After decades of being exploited, Africa is beginning to take control of its oil and gas. Let's start with Nigeria. Once called the oil colony of Shell and Chevron, Nigeria is now moving toward independence. For decades, more than 90% of its oil was exported raw, with barely any refining done locally. Nigerians endured endless fuel shortages in a country swimming in crude oil. But in 2023, the $19 billion Dangote refinery, the largest in Africa, officially began operations. Suddenly, Nigeria is no longer forced to ship crude abroad just to import refined fuel at higher prices. Even more groundbreaking, Nigeria has begun signing new energy deals in yuan and naira, bypassing the U.S. dollar. China, India, and other Asian giants are stepping in where Washington once ruled. In Angola, the second largest oil producer in sub-Saharan Africa, a new chapter is also being written. Angola joined BRICS in 2024, aligning itself with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. This membership opens the door to oil for infrastructure deals, technology partnerships, and, most importantly, non-dollar trade. For the first time, Angola can sell its oil without bowing to Washington or Brussels. Mozambique, once ignored by the West, has become a centerpiece of the global LNG market. With more than 100 trillion cubic feet of natural gas in Cabo Delgado, Mozambique is signing multi-billion-dollar contracts with India, China, and even Middle Eastern buyers. The West wanted to lock this gas for Europe. Instead, Africa is selling it to the highest bidder, often outside the dollar system. In Algeria, gas pipelines that once fed Europe are now redirected. Algeria has increased shipments to Asia and is openly challenging Europe's energy blackmail. "We will sell to whoever respects us," Algerian officials declared, a direct jab at Brussels. But perhaps the boldest moves are coming from the Sahel states, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. These nations, united in the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, are openly discussing the creation of a Pan-African energy alliance. Their vision? Pooling resources, nationalizing assets, and dictating terms to the West. Niger, once a French uranium colony, has already expelled Western troops and shut down French mining contracts. Mali and Burkina Faso are moving in the same direction with their gold and energy policies. Even Ghana is stepping forward. Long reliant on oil exports, Ghana recently announced expansion of its Tema oil refinery to process crude locally. By refining at home, Ghana multiplies profits fourfold, creating jobs and keeping wealth within its borders. Everywhere you look, the same story repeats. Africa is refusing to be a raw exporter. Africa is demanding value, sovereignty, and control. This is why the West is panicking. For the first time, Africa is no longer playing by the old rules. Instead of begging for aid from the IMF, Africa is leveraging its resources to attract direct partnerships with BRICS nations. Instead of shipping raw crude and gas, Africa is building refineries, LNG plants, and petrochemical industries. The continent that once fueled Western empires is now fueling its own rise. And this rise is not quiet. It is loud. It is powerful. And it is unstoppable. In Washington, Paris, and London, alarm bells are ringing. What was once unthinkable is now reality. Africa, the so-called resource colony, is breaking free from Western control. The first signs of panic came from the oil giants themselves. ExxonMobil quietly exited key operations in Nigeria, selling off assets that had once been crown jewels of its African portfolio. Chevron followed, reducing its footprint in Chad and other regions. These companies didn't leave because the oil was gone. They left because the game had changed. African governments were no longer willing to sign contracts that gave away 90% of profits to foreigners while their people starved. Shell, one of the most infamous actors in Africa, has faced lawsuits in both Nigeria and South Africa. Decades of oil spills, corruption, and human rights abuses finally caught up. Nigerian courts demanded accountability, and for the first time, the mighty Shell was forced to pay damages. TotalEnergies, the French giant, has been forced into painful renegotiations. Once, Total dictated terms to African governments. Today, it is Africa that sets the rules, and Total must either comply or pack up and leave. In the halls of the IMF and World Bank, frustration is growing. For years, these institutions imposed structural adjustment programs that forced Africa to privatize its energy assets. Now, those very assets are being reclaimed. Loans and aid are losing their leverage because Africa has something far more valuable: oil and gas that the world desperately needs. And then there's Europe. After losing access to Russian energy following the war in Ukraine, Europe turned to Africa for salvation. Brussels believed Africa would simply increase gas and oil exports to feed Europe's industries. But Africa had other plans. Instead of rescuing Europe, Africa turned to BRICS, Asia, and its own people. Europe is now left scrambling, its leaders openly admitting they face a long-term energy crisis. In the United States, the situation is even more dire. For decades, the dominance of the U.S. dollar was reinforced by the petrodollar system, the rule that oil must be traded in dollars. But with Nigeria, Angola, and others beginning to trade in yuan, naira, or rubles, the foundation of U.S. financial power is under direct threat. Washington's response has been predictable: pressure and threats. U.S. officials have warned African leaders against aligning with adversaries, a thinly veiled reference to Russia and China. Sanctions have been discussed. Military aid has been withheld. But these tactics are losing their effect. Because Africa knows the truth, it no longer needs Washington's permission. Perhaps the clearest sign of panic came from the French government. When Niger expelled French troops and shut down uranium contracts, President Emmanuel Macron declared it unacceptable. Yet Paris could do nothing. Its era of control is over. Western think tanks now openly admit that Africa is slipping away. Reports from London and Washington describe Africa as the new front line of great power competition. But what they fail to grasp is that Africa is no longer just a prize to be competed for. Africa is now a player, a decisive, independent power in its own right. And that is why the West is panicking. Because the old game, where Africa supplied raw materials and the West controlled the wealth, is ending. A new game has begun.